Good afternoon. My name is David Anderson Hooker, and I am an associate professor of the practice of conflict transformation at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. We are welcoming you to our webinar and podcast, and are in the moment being joined by our fearless leader. And so I will give it back to him. Welcome, Asher.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you all for joining us. Good day and welcome to the webinar, Race, Violence and Protest, a conversation about the ongoing struggle for justice. My name is Asher Kaufman and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. The Kroc Institute, part of the Kaye School of Global Affairs, is one of the world's leading centers for the study of the causes of violent conflict and strategies for sustainable peace. In my capacity as director of Kroc, I posted on Saturday an announcement stating that in light of the wave of protests and riots for social justice, we joined the call for action. Our commitment to nonviolence guides our research, teaching, practice, and outreach. Our support for this social movement for justice is an integral part of our mission. But what action could and should we take individually and institutionally? How can we strive to keep this struggle nonviolent, knowing that this is both a moral imperative as well as the most effective way for transformative change? Why has this wave of protest erupted now, despite the fact that racial violence against Black Americans has been ongoing for decades and centuries? Is this protest wave different from previous outbreaks of struggles for racial justice? Will it bring the change we seek? These are some of the questions that the panelists will address in their presentations. And I'm very pleased to introduce our five panelists. David Anderson Hooker, whom you've already met, Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding. And David will also facilitate the conversation between the panelists. Ashley Bohrer, Assistant Professor of Gender and Peace Studies. Helina Haile, a 2020 graduate of the Kaye School Masters of Global Affairs, International Peace Studies concentration. And Mische, Associate Professor of Sociology and Peace Studies. And Karsonya Whitehead, an alumni of the MA program of the Kroc Institute, and an Associate Professor of Communication in African and African American Studies at Loyola University, Maryland, and host of Today with Dr. Kaye on WEAA in Baltimore. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. We are in the midst of a global pandemic. We are in the midst of an economic downturn that in many ways rivals, it exceeds the Great Recessions of a few decades ago and rivals the Great Depression earlier in the 20th century. We have a panoply of failing state functions, the capacity to provide clean water, clean air, decent education, access to food. And in the midst of that, there seems to be an ongoing pattern and practice of the death, extrajudicial killing of Black and brown-bodied people at the hands of the state, or impunity for those even who are not state functionaries. And so the United States, these failing to be United States, have erupted once again. We're asking ourselves, what is there to do? And so our conversation for today, the title of the panel is A Conversation on Race, Violence, Protest, and the Ongoing Struggle for Justice. My colleagues and fellow panelists, I'm sure, will talk about violence, direct and cultural and structural violence, and talk about social movements and protest and even struggle. So what I wanted to do was situate a few minutes of remarks in relationship to the issue of justice itself. Justice is a ubiquitously deployed concept that often lacks a clear definition and it often, as such, proves to be elusive. For some, justice reflects this concept of an outcome, a product of some sort. When people say justice was served in that case, often they're talking about justice as a product, or they may be saying that the cause of justice was served. But it's difficult to discern what the cause of justice actually is when an otherwise peaceful, nonviolent, and from all accounts, gospel-singing, God-fearing man has pressure applied by a knee on his neck until the life is drained out of his body in the name of justice. At the same time, in that same city, protesters have taken to the streets to disrupt the normal ways of life as in the name of justice. And some, a very small number, are smashing and looting buildings and burning other property and destroying property, some in the name of justice, some clearly for the purposes of mischief and mayhem making. But it's difficult to know then what justice is, if justice is a cause or a product. In a brilliantly penned op-ed for, I think it was Atlantic magazine, NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar concludes his remarks by saying, with regard to the officers in Minneapolis, he is not looking for a rush to judgment, but what he does want is a rush to justice, which is to suggest for Abdul-Jabbar, justice is a process. And so justice could either be a process or a product, or it could be a state of affairs. But it's not clear what justice actually is. There's not consensus yet on what justice is, and so it remains elusive even in our effort. And so today in our conversation, a struggle for justice, will hopefully wrestle with what this justice is. Professor Colleen Murphy, who's also a Notre Dame grad, invites us to think about this question of justice. Are there certain conditions where certain types or approaches to justice may be appropriate? For instance, if the law was mostly being followed and there were a few people who were lawbreakers, then standard forms of justice, either punishment-focused retributive justice or relationship-focused restorative justice, may be an appropriate response if there were only a few lawbreakers. Restorative justice, we're not sure. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery couldn't really participate in any restorative process at this point. The harm that's been done, we would suggest, for them is irreparable. And even if somehow the officers could make amends to the families and communities, it would be hard to imagine that tears and apologies, some burning of sage, and 2 or 3 verses of Kumbaya could ever properly reestablish the boundaries in society. And so it's not clear if there's either punishment or a sufficient effort at restoration. Actually, retribution and restorative justice assume that it's only a few lawbreakers. And I would imagine that the families and communities of Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Renisha McBride, Philindro Castile, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant, Khalif Browder, and so many more. Martin King, Malcolm X, Jose Campos Torres, Cesar Chavez, countless others, and more than 4,500 people who experienced racial terror in the form of lynching, or the massive anti-Black lawlessness in Tulsa, Atlanta, Rosewood, and Greensboro. All of that suggests that we're not facing a suitable form for small ball forms of justice. And so restorative justice, retributive justice may not, in fact, work. In fact, it suggests that even today, a reliance on the currently structured criminal justice system would be what one of my early mentors, Bobby Wright, would describe as an indicator of menticide. Menticide, M-E-N-T-A-C-I-D-E. Bobby defines that as the systematic destruction of a group of people's mind with the ultimate aim being the complete extirpation of the race. And among the clearest indicators of menticidal thought, from Bobby's perspective, would be when a people, while being completely aware that certain systems are crafted for their destruction or oppression, or at the very least to minimize their capacities for full flourishing, those people would still rely on those systems for their own uplift. For Bobby, the big deal was education. Black and brown-bodied people relying on state-sponsored education to prepare their children to overcome state-devised oppression. That would be menticidal. In the current instance, the idea that the courts where laws have been interpreted for centuries in ways that affirm Supreme Court Justice Haney's conclusion in the infamous Dred Scott decision that a Black man has no rights that a white person is duty-bound to respect. It was harsh when Justice Haney said it. People have tried to soften the tenor, but in a fabulous Harvard Law Review article, Professor Cheryl Taylor describes and details the repeated instances in when the courts at every level have sought to affirm what they describe as the property value of whiteness. And so relying on the current courts as structured would probably be menticidal. So if it's not retributive justice, restorative justice, current criminal justice, maybe it's distributive justice, where it's just one organization in society that needs to be fixed, or one institution. That was the logic for Brown versus the Board of Education. But I would suggest that the interlocking systems of housing segregation, healthcare, employment discrimination, and kind of a certain form of religiosity all work to maintain hierarchies and oppressive social arrangements and indicate that distributive justice may not be what's called for. And so we may be moving into the era of transitional, transformative, or healing justices, all approaches that demand or at least encourage a complete societal transformation. In conflict and transformation, we often use this tree metaphor where we've got the fruit of the tree, like oppression, like extrajudicial killing with impunity, mass incarceration, unequal access. We think about the trunk as structures, institutions like education, criminal justice, healthcare, residential real estate. And the roots are kind of like racism, heteronormativity, and patriarchy. And yet, because these same systems are popping up all over the world, which is why there are George Floyd protests in Bethlehem, Paris, Bonn, Tahrir Square, and Juba, South Sudan, we have to consider that US institutions are simply one manifestation of a larger problem. The thing that is plaguing us, this pandemic of supremacy, is what we would describe as rhizomatic. It curls all along, it grows all along, its rooting system plants in everything. It's like ginger or bamboo or kudzu. It has no beginning, it has no end. You cannot effectively uproot rhizomatic plants because they have no beginning, they have no end, they have a continuation logic, but not an organizational logic otherwise. The only effective way to permanently address rhizomes is by changing the composition of the soil. And so in this moment, as we're thinking about the actions that we have to take, not only are we being called upon to do the fruit work, to address the immediate issues of the day and the structural work, police reform, abolition, demilitarization, defunding, and some have to go longer term work like reimagining policing so that we distribute the responsibility of policing in ways that communities are primarily responsible for their own policing. And then when we do involve state-sponsored policing, maybe we reshape it such that much of the police is a police service and a very small portion is a police force. So in addition to doing fruit work, trunk work, we also have to do the dirt work. And what's in the dirt, I would suggest, is whiteness. Colleen Murphy was one of my law professors. She helped me as a writer to think about redundancies. And so one of the clear ones that I always remember is I used to write period of time or time period. And she says that's redundant. Time only exists in periods. Periods are time, are measures of time. So you don't have to say both. Similarly, we don't have to say that we're undoing white supremacy or white privilege, or as my friend Suli P would say, caucasity. All of that is redundant. Whiteness is a socially constructed political sphere that narrates who should have access to privileges and resources and who should be denied the same. White is a social construction, not connected to skin color, because as we know from history, the Polish had to work to be white and the Irish and the Italians had to become white. The way that you gain access to the privileges is by the performance of anti-Blackness. This is something that many immigrant shopkeepers who themselves are people of color learn as a strategy so that when they set up their shops and businesses, when some of them set up their shops and businesses in Black, brown communities, they have every intention of gaining access to the privileges of whiteness by the performance of anti-Blackness. The police are also set up to operate as a vanguard of resistance to Black and brown people's freedom-seeking behaviors. But I would still say the people are not the problem. The problem is the problem. The problem is in the dirt. We have to do dirt work. And so the two questions that I would propose for our long-term pursuit in this context of justice, these are the two questions. First is, what would it take to create a world in which everyone and everything had fundamentally equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority needed to survive, thrive, and fully manifest their capabilities in ways that supported the greatest good and shared future? Let me ask that just again, because it's kind of complex. What would it take to create a world in which everyone had fundamentally equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, and testimonial authority they needed to survive, thrive, and fully manifest their capabilities in ways that supported the greatest good and built for a shared future? The second question is, can we create that world and still operate within the fictional constraints of whiteness and non-whiteness? I'm actually excited to hear the other panelists offer some opening remarks, and then we will engage one another with some questions that have been previously submitted, some questions that are being submitted even now. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. We were going to hear first from Helina, Haile, who didn't know when she graduated just a few weeks ago that we were going to dump her back off in Minneapolis, her home, to continue to practice and study peace. And so I look forward to hearing from Helina.
Thank you, David. I'm really excited to be here. I just want to start off by first saying that it's really interesting we're having this discussion during Pride Month, and I would like to honor Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, Black and brown trans women who have stood up against police brutality, and that is how Pride started. I want to create a disclaimer too. I have the utmost respect for frontline organizers who put their bodies on the line daily and devote tremendous amount of energy and labor into doing this work. I am not a frontline organizer, and so I hope I can do them some justice in this discussion. I'll keep my opening remarks to talking about the context of Minnesota and hitting a little bit on this violent, nonviolent protest discussion, and I look forward to later on talking about actionable steps we can take. Just to give a little context to Minneapolis, CeCe McDonald in 2012, a Black trans woman, took 41 months of prison time for manslaughter in an act of self-defense. Jamar Clark was shot and murdered by 2 Minneapolis Police Department officers in November 2015, and Mike Freeman decided no charges would be brought. Philando Castile was shot and murdered in St. Anthony suburbs in July 2016 with his daughter in the back seat, and a jury acquitted the officer. Justine Damund in 2017 was shot by a Minneapolis Police Department officer as well and killed. And $21 million from 2007 to 2018 has been used in police misconduct claims. So Minneapolis is a history of racial disparity. Minnesota has one of the largest disparity gaps between white and Black Minnesotans. And this is seen in the rate of poverty for Black Minnesotans, which is at 32%, which is the 3rd highest in the country. And this shows up in employment, home ownership, education, economic development, and so on. This disparity has been labeled the Minnesota paradox by Professor Samuel Myers Jr. at University of Minnesota. He states it's a result of continued social benefits made possible to white Minnesotans at the expense of Black and brown people. And so I want to first start off by saying what I saw when I was out at the memorial site for George Floyd and at the state capitol sit-in. I saw a lot of community. I saw free food and drinks. I saw prayer. I saw visioning for the future with questions such as, what does community care look like in a world free of police? I saw mutual aid efforts, free food, baby formula, and so on. I saw restaurants and organizations doing pop-up food pantries. I saw intersectional solidarity. I saw the East African community, the Somali, Eritrean, Ethiopian communities out to protest. I saw the Latinx community. I saw Asians for Black Lives, and I saw the Indigenous community. And I saw a youth-led resistance. And contrary to what the news media will tell you, it's organized. there's healing, there's community, and there's visioning for the future, and it's making an impact. University of Minnesota has decided to cut their contract with the Minneapolis Police Department. So has the Minneapolis public school system, which is going to be a huge monumental thing to not have school resource officers criminalizing our youth. So I want to hit on a lot of these discussions that we're having about violence and nonviolence. As I was at the sit-in at the Capitol, National Guard surrounded us, military tanks were out, and it was a very heavy experience. And I've been hearing a lot about the discussions about violence and nonviolence, and I want to start off by saying we need to stop delegitimizing Black anger. It is valid, and we should not police the pain of Black people. Yes, rioting, or what we call rioting, looting, and so on, is a political strategy. And look, it has us talking now, doesn't it? And I want to question why we use the term rioting, because a riot is a disturbance of peace. But what peace? Is it peace for white Americans and the economically advantaged people of color? Because when have Black people experienced peace in this country, especially in relationship to the violent state? White supremacy has been terrorizing and torturing Black people for hundreds of years. We've resisted by creating our own peace through healing, activism, and creating new relationships that are rooted in love. Everyone loves to quote Martin Luther King Jr. during this time, who was once the most hated man in America. And he is often co-opted into shaming other Black Americans for the way they protest. But getting to peaceful protest during the civil rights movement meant enduring a lot of violence. Black people were at the receiving end. So why isn't the focus on the violence perpetuated by the police and other state actors? Why is violence only seen through the gaze of property damage? If this was another country, we'd be calling this a revolution, an uprising. However, we've gone with rioting when it comes to Black Americans, the same word we use when white people act out when their favorite sports team wins. That's insanity. And the peaceful, non-peaceful binary is completely oppressive and reinforces respectability politics. We only want people who protest in a way we deem appropriate, in a way that demands our respect. I reject a hierarchy of victimhood that perpetuates hierarchy of victimhood, and I question why Black people are expected to be morally superior while facing immoral conditions. This seems to be more so about coercing Black complacency and forgiveness that can absolve white people of their guilt. And I think it also makes invisible the ways in which this country was developed on looted land and resources through violence and uncompensated Black labor. Let us not forget that a month ago, $500 billion in stimulus money was given for corporations alone. How is that not looting? We embody capitalist values so much to the point that many people are more concerned about corporations and property. Let us remember there was a time when Black bodies were property in this country. But why are we not concerned about the violence that has led us here? We must reframe our perspective. If you're more outraged by looting of billion-dollar corporations or stores, these corporations have insurance money. They will be okay. But instead, we're focusing on looting as defined by corporations, and we're further criminalizing Black people. But I say Black lives are worth more than shoes, broken windows, and clothes. As for minority-owned businesses, I think we need to take a more nuanced analysis, and I will say in Minneapolis, and it's specifically North Minneapolis, they are deploying community watch groups to protect businesses, and they're doing so in a way that does not recreate policing. So it's not an opportunity for vigilantism, because we're creating opportunities outside of opportunities and alternatives for calling the police. But I want to go back to what David mentioned. Let's not forget the intersectional analysis of race and class. When I think of minority-owned businesses in Northside, I think of the Korean American hair store that followed me and my friends around, that called the cops on Black people. I'm reminded of the numerous convenience stores owned by Arab Americans which engage in poverty tax prices. So this conversation about race, specifically in this time, is a question of anti-Blackness. And this also means bringing in non-Black people of color who engage in anti-Black rhetoric because they want to leverage their proximity to whiteness to reinforce anti-Black racism. And so I'm really glad to be here, and I look forward to discussion about actionable steps we can take. Thank you.
Dr. Kaye, we would love to hear your reflections, particularly as it relates to whatever you were going to share, but if there was also insights from Baltimore and the relationship between what we're seeing now and the Freddie Gray uprisings that you were in the midst of, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me into the conversation. I definitely appreciate everything that Helina said, and I definitely believe you did justice to people who are frontline organizers in your remarks. I want to begin by just stopping for a moment and recognizing that we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're having a conversation about the death of Black people during a time when Black people are dying at 3 times the rate of white people because of COVID-19. I think we can't move forward until we understand that at this moment, that Black people who are out in the front lines, and they're joined, of course, by a diverse group of people, are willing to catch COVID-19 and possibly die from it in order to bring about justice in this country. I think that cannot be understated, because we have 1.8 million people who have been impacted and who have tested positive for COVID-19, and we're dealing with 106,000 people that have died. It is hard for me to separate the two. And what I would like to suggest is that white America is in the midst of a pandemic, and Black America is in the midst of a syndemic. It's a very different thing. And a syndemic was put forward by Singer et al. And what it talks about multiple things that happen that disregard and lead to destruction to the physical, mental, psychological, social, and emotional health of a population. So we're not just dealing with COVID-19, though we're dying at a higher rate. We're also dealing with the impact of racism and the reality of police brutality as it pertains to our community. We talk a lot, and Helina mentioned this, about how people quote Dr. King. I mostly disregard anybody who quotes Dr. King before 1966. I figure that what they want is they want the Dr. King of I Have a Dream speech. When Dr. King, if you listen to his speech before he got to the end, before Mahalia Jackson said, tell him about the dream, what he talked about in his speech earlier was about go back to your own communities and dismantle what he mentioned as the 3 evils: militarism, racism, and capitalism. He had been talking about this. So as we're watching this play out around communities, what we're seeing is a part of the Dr. King dream that people don't want to talk about, which is you've got to be willing to dismantle capitalism, whatever it takes, whatever the possibility that you can imagine of living in a different society, then be willing to do that work. We've been sheltered in place since March. And I think that we all understand that if we had sheltered earlier as a country, 56,000 people less would have died from COVID-19. In the midst of being sheltered at place, Black folks have still been targeted. They've still been tortured, and they've still been dying. As we have focused our energy on George Floyd, the way he was killed, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds with the knee on his neck, the way in which he spoke 114 words, particularly the words where he called for his mother. And he also stated the words that Mike Brown said 6 years ago. If we had listened back then to what I can't breathe means for Black people, maybe we would not be at this position right now. I think we have to know that at the same time that was happening to George Floyd in Minneapolis, a place, by the way, as Helina noticed, where cops are 13 times more likely to target Black men than white men, we were also dealing with a situation that happened in New York with Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, no relation to the two, but that the start of Black men ending up dead on the ground begins with white people and people not of color, or people who are tapped into the white supremacist system, looking to use the cops in the way we call our cousins to, you know, swoop in and help us out. That Amy Cooper's desire and her belief that if I call the cops and tell them that a Black man is threatening me, then they're going to show up guns blazing and save me, though let's be clear, there was nothing she needed to be saved from except her own white supremacy, right? So we got that on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, we were talking about that video of a Black man dying on film jogging in Georgia. Now, it didn't hit people in the same way because you didn't see the gunshot. You saw them wrestle, stumble behind a truck, and the next thing you saw is Arbery dropping to the ground. That video comes out of February. The fact that it took 74 days and the release of the video before Travis and Gregory McMichael would be arrested only speaks to the ways in which this country gives permission to rogue police officers and would-be vigilantes to exercise their right to be free, to exercise their right to do whatever they want when the recipient is a Black or brown body. We've also been talking a lot about Breonna Taylor, and I don't want to lose her name in this discussion, because what is happening with Breonna Taylor and Brittany Cooper's latest piece in Time magazine makes it clear that Black women get lost in this discussion. There's a reason why Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, launched hashtag say her name, because we don't talk about Black women. But Breonna Taylor was killed March 31st in her own home. I want to note tomorrow would have been Breonna Taylor's 27th birthday, and her killers are still walking around free. Now, in connecting this to Baltimore, and those of us in Baltimore are extremely irritated that in Minneapolis, the first thing they said is that, well, in Baltimore, you moved too quickly, and therefore those police officers were free. They've pulled Baltimore back into this conversation, and those of us from Baltimore are not very happy that every time people are looking for an example of what went wrong in the justice system, they look to that moment in Baltimore rather than the work we've been doing for the last 5 years since the death of Freddie Gray to try to rebuild our city and to try to dismantle the active police department that doesn't understand that we are full-fledged residents of this city and of this country. But to compare it to Baltimore in a very broad sense, if you look on the ground, you think it's similar. Freddie Gray was killed, George Floyd was killed. In George Floyd, when you look at the George Floyd case, that video is what sets it apart from Freddie Gray. I will use the words of Marilyn Mosby, our Baltimore City State's attorney, who said, the video of George Floyd is what any prosecutor, anybody would love to have in their hand, because the evidence is right there before you. There is no before where you can have a discussion about what you think happened. There is no after where you can wonder what happened after the cameras went off. We have to think about the young teenage girl that actually videotaped the before, the during, and the after in the George Floyd case, which we did not see with Freddie Gray. The death of Freddie Gray, the murder of Freddie Gray, led to a wide-scale uprising in this city. I know everyone talks about that Tuesday when the city was both metaphorically and literally, in some cases, on fire. Prior to that, we had marched for 11 days straight seeking justice for Freddie Gray. I was on the ground. I would pick my sons up from school. We would get them a snack in the car, and we would head to Freddie Gray's neighborhood for 11 days. And we demanded that our mayor, at the time, Mayor Stephanie Rawlins-Blake, show up and listen to us, and nobody did. We asked the press to show up and cover 11 days of peaceful protests involving our children and our elders and those of us in between, and nobody was interested in that story, because nobody's interested in the stories of Black people doing healing work. All they want to see is Black people doing rioting so that can feed into their stereotypes of how Black people are out of control. So we understand that, but we were doing the work. And even on that Tuesday, when things exploded because of the police department putting out that flyer saying the students at Douglas High School were planning to do a purge. I mean, the idea that Black kids are using the purge anyway was something that was suspect. But going into that community where Douglas High School got out of school, they already had an active military presence And the students were blocked off. They couldn't get on the subway because they shut the subways down. They couldn't get on the bus. They shut the bus down. They couldn't go back to their school. What do you expect people to do when you've trapped them on all sides as they're getting out of school? That happened on that Tuesday. But by that Wednesday, we were out there. Myself, my kids, pastors, we were out there at 7 o'clock in the morning, going around looking to restore, clean up, lend a hand, because we were looking to save our city. It was hard on the ground work. And I am hopeful in this conversation that we look at what is happening with George Floyd. Because in talking about George Floyd, for some people who, I don't understand what world they're living in, but it's like they're just waking up to Black Lives Matter. Like they've been wearing the t-shirts and they've been using the Starbucks coffee cups to say Black Lives Matter without understanding that for Black lives to matter, it means you're gonna have to put yourself on the line. Like white folks are gonna have to show up and stand there and be white, which means get in front of us because we know the system respects you. We can use Dylan Storm Roof as an example. It respects you in ways that they don't respect us. And as I wrap up, I just want to say in the conversation as we unpack the ways in which we can revamp the police department, the ways in which we can talk about and unpack white supremacy, I just want to end with what George Floyd's daughter said. I think a lot about 2020 because coming into 2020, when we were dealing with the untimely death of Kobe Bryant and Gianna Bryant, for many of us, we thought that was going to be 2020. Like 2020 would be the year when all we were talking about was Kobe Bryant and Gianna Bryant. And we've gone from Kobe Bryant to Gianna Bryant to COVID-19 to UFOs to mad hornets to cannibalistic rats to an asteroid getting ready to pass by the side of an Empire State Building and to now dealing with the reality of Black Lives Matter. George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, Gianna, was on the neck of one of his friends. And this is a recent video that just came out. And she was talking about her daddy. And she said, "My daddy changed the world." I think there's something very disturbing in the belief that for our fathers and our uncles and our brothers to change the world, they have to be killed before they can receive justice, before they can have the humanity that's been denied to them in life that can be given to them in death. So that's where I'd like the conversation to go today.
Thank you so much. And I know Ashley was going to come in and talk a bit about intersectionality and power and violence and wherever you were going to go. So.
Thanks. I just want to start by saying that all of what the previous two panelists have said, I give like a hearty, rousing endorse. And I think the place that I want to start today is actually in talking about what the police are and what the police do in this country. I think we often start the conversation around police brutality as if this is an anomaly rather than the structure they are created to perpetuate. And so I want to frame my remarks thinking about the racialized police brutality that we're seeing a response to this week and that we know has been a constancy for centuries in this country. But I really want to start with what do the police do and where do they come from? So the United States police force and police forces across the United States are generally recognized to have two institutional precursors. And both of those are deeply important to understanding what the police are doing today, yesterday, last week, and last year in cities and jurisdictions across the country. The first institutional precursor to the police was white vigilante gangs who organized amongst themselves to patrol those who had risked life and limb to escape bondage and slavery. The first organized police forces in the United States come out of slave catching patrol white vigilantism. And that history has not gone away or been erased simply because the legal system has mostly transformed to eliminate enslavement, though we do know that there is an exception clause in the Constitution for those who are incarcerated. And that's something that I don't want to lose in this conversation, the centrality not only of policing, but also what policing leads to, which is death and incarceration. The second institutional precursor for police forces in this country were the first centralized municipal police departments. The first one was founded in Boston. And what happened there was, before centralized municipal police departments, individual white property owners had paid out of pocket for the own protection of their property. And in the beginning of during the 19th century, a variety of Boston white property owners, who obviously held stolen indigenous property, figured out a strategy that rather than paying for the protection of their property on their own, they could market or package the protection of their property as a public good and finance it through state coffers. Now, this began in Boston and quickly spread to New York City, Albany, Chicago, Philly, and then finally elsewhere in the United States. Now, why do I think it's important to hold on to these two moments? Well, because what the police do in their daily operation is protect, on the one hand, white supremacy, and on the other hand, capitalism and private property. Especially when we think about these centralized municipal police departments, their original charge was not to police crime, it was to police disorder. Disorder. And I think that understanding that what police do in their day-to-day is enforce the reigning order is the absolute linchpin of what we have to think about. And here's why. In this country, when the police uphold order, they uphold the order of white supremacy. When the order is unjust, upholding order means that your job is perpetuating and stabilizing injustice from dismantling, from critique, and it means insulating the continual perpetuators of that system. Now, I think when we talk about police brutality, we tend to, right now in this moment, some people for the first time, talk about police brutality in a racialized sense, but police brutality is also, it happens at the intersection of not just race, but also class and also gender. It is important to think about the ways that the police interact with people across these various identities differ in their fundamental constitution. So while we often see videos, for example, of police brutality that involves shootings and extrajudicial killings, we very rarely see the favorite tool of police brutality against racialized women, which is the extortion of sex, the rape in the back of police cars and in incarceration, and various other forms of deeply gendered and sexualized violence that is also an epidemic in this country and that must also be uplifted as a form of police brutality. Thinking about the history of policing in this country, I think it is also important to note that what we see here, what is happening in the US, might feel to those of us who have never encountered or seen anything different, like this is just normal. This is just what police do all over the place, right? And I think it is important, not in any way to hold up other places as a standard, but just to get a baseline understanding of how what is happening here is the instantiation of a militarized extrajudicial system of violence perpetuated by the police in ways that are significantly different from what happens elsewhere. So, thing one to talk about there, not all cops carry guns. Not all cops in all countries carry guns, right? Tons of countries, Ireland, the UK, New Zealand, Iceland, police officers do not carry weapons, right? They are not allowed to carry guns. They certainly do not have access to the variety of military-grade equipment that I have seen in my city this week alone. LRAD sound cannons designed to burst protesters' eardrums, tanks on the streets of cities, militarized tanks on the streets of cities across the country, grenades, sniper rifles, tear gas, which, for the record, has been banned in warfare since the Geneva Protocols of 1925, but is perfectly legal to disperse on protesters in every state in this country. The rate of killing of people by police in this country is actually astronomical. Over 1,000 people are killed every year by police in what can only be described as an extrajudicial system of sanctioned murder. Again, let's just do some basic comparisons. In 2019, 1,099 people killed by police in the United States. In Denmark, 0. In Switzerland, 0. In New Zealand, 1. 1 too many, but 1. In the UK, 3. Okay, let's compare ourselves to somewhere closer. Let's say Canada, 36. India, 135, right? We are talking about a level of extrajudicial killing by the police that far eclipses anything else that is happening around the world at this time. And the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the history of the world. And in that backdrop, right, one might say, okay, so this happens at a greater rate. Surely there's some sort of check, right? Surely there's some sort of response. In the 12-year period between 2005 and 2017, around 12,000 people were murdered by uniformed officers. 12,000 people murdered by uniformed officers. 80 were charged, 28 were convicted. Now, I'm not suggesting that we rely on the judicial system for exactly all of the reasons that David Hooker lined out in his opening remarks. But what I think is important to understand is that what we are seeing right now is not a response to an isolated incident. We're not even witnessing an accumulated response to the very few names that we know, right? Like names that have become touchstones for movement and social justice organizing. We are witnessing a response and a rejection to an entire system that prioritizes whiteness and property over the lives, feelings, desires, and communities of color. That is what we are witnessing a response to. And if at any point in time we are talking about this protest wave or rebellion or potential revolution or whatever language comes to you to talk about the thousands and thousands of brave souls standing on the streets for justice right now, if we lose sight of the fact that what we are seeing is a response against an accumulated system of hundreds of years of brutality and violence, if we lose sight of the fact that we are witnessing an uprising and a rejection of the idea that the order of this country should be white supremacy, capitalism, and private property, then I think we are significantly missing the revolutionary and justice-based message that the protesters around the country have been sending. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you, Ashley. So I'm excited to invite Mische in, who studies a lot about protests and social movements. And one of the questions that we're getting a lot of, and I'm adding this into your remarks, one of the questions that we're getting a lot of online right now is, what about this makes it a tipping point? Like, we've seen people get killed before, we've had video before, we've had all kinds of things. What do you imagine? And then I'll invite, after your remarks, invite some of the other panelists to come to this. Why are we at a tipping point? What in the social movement, realm helps us to know this might be at a tipping point?
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm very grateful for the I'm a sociologist and I study work on social movements. And I want to reflect on what my field has to say about not only when protests erupt, but about when they lead to deeper institutional and structural change. It's because previous protests have not led to deeper changes that the current uprisings have become so disruptive and widespread. As most of you know, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged in a very decentralized way across successive episodes of police killings of Black and brown men and women. In 2014, that is 6 years ago, there were also massive protests around the country, including here at Notre Dame. Many of us participated in a student-led die-in outside of DeBartolo Hall to protest the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. In 2014, some of you will recall that the Notre Dame women's basketball team wore t-shirts to practice that said, "I can't breathe." Yet here we are again. Right now, I think that there is a tension between two different discourses about the protests. One cites Dr. King, the later Dr. King, that riots are the voices of the unheard. It argues that the unrest and the destruction of property are expressions of well-justified rage over systemic racism, structural violence, economic exploitation, and the dehumanization of communities of color. Let it burn, as this is the only way to generate attention and action from authorities. They're not wrong. The other perspective argues that violence is distracting from the message and the focus of the protests. Most of the destruction is coming from opportunists and outsiders who are not committed to the political and economic power of the Black community. This is especially dangerous when we have a proto-fascist president mobilizing hatred and militarized repression as a means of consolidating his own power. Both perspectives are arguably right, but the tension between them can be paralyzing. As peace builders, should we condone the violence or condemn it? How do we move forward? Let me unpack this tension by drawing, I'm just going to share my screen, by drawing on 6 lessons from social movement scholarship. First of all, it's a mistake, and I think this is what Helina was saying, it's a mistake to dichotomize the distinction between violent versus nonviolent movements. The threat and the possibility of violence is nearly always present in protests. It's part of their power. Repression by authorities can provoke and escalate violent responses by challengers, and both protesters and authorities can make minute-by-minute choices to de-escalate and turn away from such provocation. Second, it isn't really the violence or the nonviolence that's at issue here, it's the capacity of a movement for disruption. Classic work by Piven and Cloward argues that movements of poor and marginalized people are only successful when they generate massive civil unrest. That basically makes them a headache for local and federal authorities. We got the New Deal, labor protections, the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act, and the war on poverty because of a large-scale disruption from food riots and wildcat strikes in the 30s to the sit-ins, freedom rides and marches, and the urban unrest of the 1960s. And let's recall that while the civil rights movement was resolutely nonviolent, it worked because it provoked violent responses by local authorities. Recall Bull Connor in Birmingham. Federal authorities had to deal with this through pacifying interventions and eventually through programmatic reforms. Now, there's a danger. Piven and Cloward also argue that when authorities respond to protests with programmatic changes, they may recruit activists to administer those programs. Now that sounds great, except that's also a way to co-opt them and get them off the streets. In the long term, this can mean less pressure on elites and authorities. Many labor, civil rights, and social safety net protections have been rolled back as street pressure declines. Number 4, disruptive movements can fade away if they aren't given institutional and relational durability. Now this means doing the hard work of organizing, building and sustaining grassroots networks and organizations, and having them engage in visible projects that build political, economic, and professional power in communities. In social movement analysis, we call these mobilizing structures. Sometimes this means using existing sites like communities of faith and universities. Sometimes it means building new organizations explicitly focused on the goals of the movement. Fifth, as all organizers know, coalitions are essential. And there are two important kinds of coalitions. We can call the first intersectional ones. Intersectional coalitions articulate relations across different experiences of marginalization and oppression. There are also insider-outsider coalitions that social movement analysts also study. These are coalitions that are between actors who challenge state institutions from the outside and those who work as activists within the state, working to formulate, legislate, and implement reforms. Getting programmatic and systemic change requires working with people with whom we do not agree completely, or we may not think are as radical or adhere to all the positions that we would like, but that's sometimes what it takes to build these kinds of coalitions. And then finally, movements need creative ways to resist the containment and the invisibilizing efforts by both the media and authorities. And I'm really thinking about this because of the protests in South Bend this weekend. On Saturday, there were, I guess officially two, but I think at least kind of 3 episodes of protest. They mostly got positive press coverage, but the final march to the police station when the protesters went through, shut down the major artery, arrived at the police station. That really, I would say, could have barely any coverage, perhaps because both the police and the protesters avoided escalation. The police were actually practically absent from the protests in South Bend, which you would think would be good. But the local news station mentioned that their car was lightly vandalized, but what they did not report was the protesters' call for Black unity. They did not report on their call for building political, economic, and professional power in the city through calling for the vote, people running for office, opening businesses, occupying positions of authority in the community. The protest was restless, it was angry, but these positive messages, these were not reported at all, thus reinforcing the idea that if there is no violence, that it is not newsworthy. Movements need to find independent media sources to sidestep these containment efforts and create other ways of reinforcing and publicizing their challenging and power building messages. And with that, I'll turn it back to David and we can start the discussion about what I think that, as Helina called on us to think about, what are some of the constructive steps that can be taken to build the kind of challenging power that is necessary to confront white supremacy in this country.
Thank you, Anne. So I know that there are a number of questions about what are the next steps, what are some action items, and so I think that our framing around that, if we consider a nested theory where there are individual, relational, communal, regional, national, international kinds of actions that can be taken. And some of those actions will have immediate impact. Some of them will show their benefits over the course of a decade, a generation, an era, an age, but all of them are important. I'm wondering if you all want to speak to what you think are some of the really important actions that can be taken now, even if their benefit is designed for the 10, 12 year kind of 10, 25 year kind of full manifestation or benefit. So I want to invite each of you to talk about that and frame, because we're having this conversation about a struggle for justice. We're still pursuing justice. And so I would love for each of you, as you talk about the actions that we can take, to frame it inside of your understanding of what is this justice that we seek. If you could speak to that. This is pop-up style, so in any order, whoever wants to lean in first. Helina, I see you leaning in, and so I'm calling on you, pull you up.
Perfect. Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this question of justice. And I know right now the dominant calls have been for prosecuting all 4 men in the George Floyd case, which is understandable, I think, in a society in which we tend to see justice interpreted as punitive and retributive. But I want us to remember that the system is created to protect cops, especially white cops. It didn't protect Somali Minneapolis Police Department officer Mohammed Noor when he shot and killed a white woman in Minneapolis. He's currently serving time for that. And there wasn't the same level of support from the Minneapolis Police Department, Police Union, and FOP. I do not believe in reform. I do not believe in the more good cops or more cops of color narrative. Even in the George Floyd case, one of the cops is Asian American. They stood by and watched because of their affiliation being part of this good boys club. Changing out white cops who uphold the system for POC cops that do the same will not save us. The institution of policing, as Ashley said, started as slave patrol. It's rooted in white supremacist patriarchy and capitalism with protection of property as its main point. And I think the true answer for justice is abolition. We do not reform police brutality. We abolish the police. We transform our social ties in communities so we don't continue to rely on the carceral police state that continues to perpetuate violence. And I stand by the calls by the Black Visions Collective, Reclaim the Block, and MPD 150, and many others who are asking for the abolition of the Minneapolis Police Department. And I think abolition is not just the absence of prison and police, but the creation of new ways of being in community together that does not rely on the state and the prison industrial complex. And so I think we need to defund the Minneapolis Police Department and instead invest into life-giving resources for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We need to be pouring in funding to investing in better education, living wage jobs, safe housing, healthcare services, trauma healing services, harm reduction strategies, and so on. We need to stop thinking we can incarcerate away addiction, poverty, mental health issues, and so on. That is simply reactionary, and we must be proactive and engage the root causes of the issues present. And the work is already happening now, and I do not want to discredit that. There are amazing Black, Indigenous, POC organizations who are doing this work. And in the words of Miriam Kaba, abolitionist communities exist now, like Naperville, Illinois, communities where they don't have daily interactions with police because they have the resources they need. So my question is, why can't Black and Brown communities deserve the same? I know mass mobilizing and protesting is a tactic and that not everyone agrees with abolitionist demands and that it is a journey and I'm still working on it myself. But I do think that we need to rethink public health, conflict resolution, and capitalism in this time. And so for me, I see justice in the way Brian Stevenson says, the opposite of poverty is justice. And so with actionable steps that people can take, I understand with the COVID-19 situation that we are all in different situations, but I do want to push back on this armchair activism. We've seen individuals and organizations make statements about BLM, and I raise my eyebrows at some of these statements because they seem to be just talk without action. And there's an abundance of performative solidarity and performative activism that is happening right now. And I say we need to embody solidarity and activism. So I'm tired of the question of what can I do? Don't wait for Black people to tell you what to do. It's not the burden of the brutalized to comfort the bystander, as Jesse Williams says. So actions that people can take involve time and money. Donate to organizations that are doing the work, grassroots organizations like Reclaim the Block, Black Visions Collective, and there's various others. If we're able to send resources at the end, I have resources. I say show up to protests and put your bodies on the line, protect Black people who are at protests, donate to organizers who aren't working with a specific organization but are doing these things solo, call out your non-Black friends, including your non-Black POC friends for their privilege and anti-Blackness, and educate yourself about alternatives to calling the police and abolition work. And as for institutions, I think it's really important. I'm tired of Band-Aid solutions. I want to say, as an alumni of Kroc, I was the only Black American in my cohort for the And for the first year, I was the only Black American for 2 cohorts. That is shameful. Why are there not more Black Americans in this program? And I'm tired of educational institutions and organizations preferring their Blackness when it's imported in from other countries. And I know as an Ethiopian immigrant, I fall into this, but I refuse to be anybody's model immigrant stereotype. And I know that's a tactic of a white supremacy to divide me against my Black American brothers and sisters. So I call educational institutions themselves why Black Americans in your program, recruit more students from America, allocate resources, Black Americans, allocate resources for this, and allocate resources to supporting them and retaining them, recruiting and supporting Black faculty and staff, focus on internships that are domestic, grassroots organizations, and stop exotifying the nature of international internships. Listen to undergraduate groups who have been doing this work, for example, Frontline and Black student associations at Notre Dame, and support BLM in your local communities such as South Bend and policy reform.
If I can jump in, I wanted to say I definitely agree with everything, and you covered almost everything I had on my list, Helina, so I appreciate you. When I attended Notre Dame, I was the first Black American student to attend the program. And so it's sad to think that that has not shifted in any significant ways from when I attended, which we don't have to go into the exact year, but when I attended, you can look that up. I don't believe justice is going to come in my lifetime. I don't think that's going to happen, because justice in our society deals with a complete dismantling of capitalism. In order to get to the things Helina is talking about, we have to dismantle the system of oppression. Why is it that Black and brown bodies are put on the line? Because Black and brown people are the infrastructure to keep the system moving. I think we cannot discount, and I know that we all enter into the COVID-19 discussion in different ways. I do a whole column called #BlackCovidStories. I do not separate what's happening with Black people in COVID-19 with what's happening with Black Lives Matter. It is 2 things happening at the same time that's resulting in Black people dying or ending up in more oppressive conditions. When we take a look at the ways in which Black people and brown people were sacrificed during COVID-19. They came in as invisible labor, because who looks at the person who's bagging your groceries or ringing you out at the cash register or dropping off your food at the door? They were invisible labor. They became essential labor so that those of us who were middle class and higher could sit at home and live our lives out in shelter and continue to have all of our foods and goods delivered to our home. They then became disposable labor, because a number of Black and brown people who were invisible and then essential, who died from COVID-19, I think is a disgrace to this country. The ways in which this country bailed out Donald Trump's millionaire business friends while only giving people $1,200 or so one time is a disgrace. The ways in which healthcare was cut during COVID-19 is a disgrace. And the ways in which Black and brown people are going to suffer is a disgrace, because as America moves on, like we're all in the Black Lives Matter moment now, I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to continue, because I have seen this country at this place before. I participated in the same conversations after Freddie Gray, the same conversations after Mike Brown. I mean, I was traveling all over the country doing the same exact work that I'm doing now, except I'm doing it from my living room on Zoom because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Things didn't change then. You talk about dismantling the police department, then show me what that's going to look like. How is that going to happen? Because we dismantle and put things together at the same time. This country works to support those who make a certain amount of money. It's always been that way. It's the people who escaped to their second home while the rest of us had to fight it out in the city without being able to get goods and services. So I'm a pessimist, but I have optimist leanings. So with the optimist leanings, I do believe that justice delayed is justice denied. If we want to get to a place where there is justice, and I know, what Brian Stevens said, to me, justice is the freedom to be able to make the simple, basic life choices, and you don't have to choose between having a place to live and having food on your table. So I would push towards reparations. I've been talking about this, the ways in which we actually put money into the Black community without acting parental and acting as a white supremacist and just assuming that Black folks won't know how to spend the money, because we can't trust Black people to make choices for their own life. I would talk about the ways in which we dismantle this oppressive education system. Like, there's so many things that need to be done, which is why I said I'm a pessimist. Because we can talk about getting through Black Lives Matter, we can talk about, abolishing the police department, and then in places like Baltimore City, we'll send our children back into schools where they don't have heat and they don't have air. That is a form of oppression that goes deeper than just let's get rid of the police in the schools. So I will put that on the ground. And I just have 3 things I want to offer up for dealing with the police department. Because it's not just Minneapolis. Minneapolis has a spotlight on them. So now they are looking to abolish, they're looking to reform. I mean, you have police officers involved in all kind of performative wokeness where they're taking a knee. And it's like, no, you are actually a part of the system that oppresses us. Last week, you were the one targeting my son as he was walking. And now you're doing the electric slide with him. It doesn't make sense. It's cognitive dissonance, which is what W.B. Du Bois talked about. One, I would say we need to demote, fire, and remove all violent cops. And I'm not just talking about violence against Black and brown bodies, but also those that have been involved in domestic violent incidences. They need to be demoted. They need to be removed. And when they are demoted, removed, fired, then they need to go into a national database of cops that have been on the line for this. Just like we have a database for people who are sex offenders, you shouldn't be able to participate in the killing of Eric Garner in New York and then go down to Wisconsin and get a job as a cop again. There should be a database. And then the third thing I think we should do is we really should do a complete rehaul and training of police officers in non-lethal ways to arrest Black and brown suspects. See, they know how to do non-lethal when the suspects are white. I always think about Dylan Storm Ruth in that police vest, being offered Burger King while people like George Floyd end up with a knee on their neck. And the fourth thing goes with the media. We should no longer allow the media, which I'm a part of it as a radio host, but today with Dr. Kaye, because what's happening now, if you've been paying attention to the papers, it's step 2 that happens every time a Black person gets killed. First, we mourn, we get upset, and then we put the victim on trial. Now, George Floyd had COVID-19. Now, George Floyd had a violent background. Now, George Floyd is a criminal, because now we're criminalizing the victim to help to justify the behavior of the police officer. So there is a complete dismantling that needs to be done. I don't think all of that's going to happen. So locally, here in Baltimore City, what we have in place is a consent decree. We're looking to hold our police officers accountable. We're looking to have a civilian review board so that officers are not judged by other officers whenever they feel they're ready to talk about what happened. And then we're looking at going into the school system and actually teaching a Black Lives Matter agenda in the schools so that we can look to have the next generation be a lot more revolutionary in their thinking and their ideas than we are and than we were.
Yeah, yes to all of that. Yes to all of that. I also believe in abolition as the horizon towards which we must not only be tending in the future, but that we must be cultivating to enact in every moment of every day, which I think I share Karsonya's complicated combination of pessimism and deep love for the revolutionary struggle and the possibility that at any moment something can change, right? We have seen that. So I think in the sort of medium to longish term, for me, the movement is decarcerate, demilitarize, defund, and disarm, right? These are I think the central building blocks of moving toward, at least on the policing and incarceration side, an abolitionist future. But I think speaking a little bit more about the sort of short term, there are a couple of things that I would like everyone watching this webinar to do today. In addition to funding or donating to all of the wonderful institutions that Helina mentioned, there are people doing essential frontline work right now in the form of protest and demanding social change, and they deserve to be supported by the community. So Donate to your local bail and bond fund who are paying to get protesters out of incarceration. Make a donation to your local National Lawyers Guild chapter who are representing those protesters for free. Make a donation to your local street medic crew who are giving medical care to protesters when police officers are preventing ambulances from dealing with the violence that they inflict. If you have skills to offer, if you're a lawyer, if you're a trained legal observer, if you're an EMT, or if you're a doctor or a nurse, join up with your local NLG chapter, your local street medic chapter. That's like another way to be on the front line helping those protesters. Be a body, right? Be a body at protests. If you're a white person, be a body ready to take a beating, right? And like protect the comrades around you. I believe that's like super important. If for whatever reason, none of those things are things that you can do, also, there are like support those who are doing jail support. Send people food, water, medical supplies, send them a pizza, buy them a coffee, give protesters who are trying to get out of militarized hot zones, give them a ride in your car to a safer location when they're trying to flee violence. Venmo people like money for Ubers and Lyfts and cabs in order to get out of those hot zones. Volunteer to be an emotional support person for people who are continuing to witness incredible amounts of violence in their streets. And just the last thing that I want to say, especially for any potentially newly radicalized white folks who might be watching this call, like, I want to speak to you for just a second. And that's to say that, like, we need to move beyond slogans. The work is not only standing up and saying we need police and prison abolition, you know, we stand against police brutality. The work is not performative. The work is also in you. The work is in unpacking all of the ways in which your life and my life have been influenced by white privilege, have been shaped by it, and have also been shaped by the way that white supremacy has damaged our ability to feel empathy. The way that white supremacy has distorted our entire version of reality such that we could look at the world and see anything other than systematic violence. That is a damage that has been done to white people through white supremacy. And it is our obligation, it is our responsibility as white people to be working on dismantling that lack of empathy, that lack of sight in ourselves, in our responses, in our communities, in our families. And that work, it both needs to start like yesterday, like right this second, needed to start 400 years ago, but like needs to happen today, tomorrow, every day. This is a long-term struggle and needs to be engaged with in the most forceful, consistent way possible.
So I am really appreciative of both the long-term, the combination of disruptive and constructive visioning that goes into the calls about the need to dismantle the system. And I'm also listening to the short-term calls that I was hearing in the protests in the community that to, you know, get out and vote and, you know, get more people elected and, you know, build community-based power and organizations. And I think that it's, for me, the tension that I'm really wrestling with, I think, is this question of the insider-outsider coalition that I was talking about before. I understand about the need to build power from outside the state. And I think that we need states, and that that states have really important coordinating and service generating and protective roles to play. And I want movements in the street, and I want the construction of alternative visions and powers from challengers. And I also want people who are committed to justice within the agencies and the concrete workings of the state. And I think that that's a challenge, because the dangers are what I talked about before. The dangers are co-optation. The dangers are the absorbing people from the movement who are no longer then offering the challenges to power. The dangers are co-optation by capitalism and by the various reinforcing systems of power and oppression. But I also feel that I also think that the having people committed to justice in the streets and in the agencies of the coordinating organizations and agencies of our society are important. And I guess that's, I mean, it's kind of a question, like how do you build both? How do you build broad intersectional coalitions that are committed to doing this kind of radical, disruptive, imaginative revisioning of how to overturn these interlocking systems, and how do we respond to the day-to-day, and how do we shape institutions? I think that institutions really matter, and that we need committed people who understand justice and who understand exclusion in institutions shaping how they work. And so that's what for me that would be. I actually like to hear your reflections on that. How do both broad intersectional coalitions and insider-outsider coalitions, how do you address the long-term disruptive and reimaginative vision, and also rebuilding police departments so that they're not killing people at this, in the short term? How do you do both of these at once? And this is like an anguished question. And I know that you all, and many of the people who are watching, are engaged in these struggles on a day-to-day basis. That's my question as a person and as a citizen, and also as a researcher. I don't feel like we have answers for that. So just kind of putting it out there that those are like the real issues that I'm wrestling with right now.
So it turns out that we're at the time that we committed for this conversation. Can you imagine? We have arrived at the end of the time that we have committed for this conversation. And so what people on the call should know is that, and I'm inviting everybody, each of you, each of the panelists, all of the different resources and action items that you suggested, that you'll send those in to us, and we will compile a list of links and resources that have been mentioned on this call, so that at least what has been offered can be a starting place. Certainly, we haven't comprehensively identified every available action, but there will be many that are listed on the call that we will have for your review as a follow-up to this call. So we heard about actions as micro as kind of our internalized ways of being, and relational and practical, communal, and then how do we build national, and how do we do that for the immediate and for the long term. So I will say I've been fascinated and spending more time reading again about fractals. And fractals are often thought of as self-repeating shapes. Those are simple fractals, but complicated fractals, the Mandelbrot type fractals, aren't actually just self-repeating shapes, But what makes something a fractal is that the relationship between each of the components is consistent. So if we had a fractal practice in which we had, for instance, values, the relational values between the components remain the same. If we had a fractal practice in which we had truth, justice, equity as fractal practice, as it relates to us in our micro, as relates to us in our families and in our intimate relationships, in our business and colleague relationships, in our organizations, if we maintained consistent relational values, then I think, and we begin to be able to answer the insider-outsider question. We'd be able to say whether the relationships are proper and which kinds of institutions are, in fact, sustainable, reformable, which ones must be abolished. As we talk about the delegitimizing, the defunding, the demilitarizing, we're also doing that in relationship to a set of practices. And so if this is an institution that's narrative doesn't, the narrative that gives logic to that institution doesn't support equity and full flourishing, if it doesn't support truth, if it doesn't support transparency and justice and equity, then we undo it, we abolish it, and then we move on and we reimagine. And so, Kate, this is a long-term process. And so hopeful in the long term, and then struggle. Pessimism is part of the struggle in the short term, but you stay in the struggle. And fractal practice yourself in every relationship you have. We might be able to, over time, as we can't answer the questions, but as Maria Wilkie would say, we live into the questions until one day, sometime in the future, we have found ourselves into the answer, and the answer will certainly be a world in which everyone has fundamentally equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, testimonial authority they need to survive, to thrive, and to contribute to a greater good for a shared future. Helina Haile, Kaye Whitehead, Dr. Kaye, Ashley Bohrer, and Mische, thank you all so much for our time together. This has been, to say the least, fun and nourishing in these otherwise dry times. So thank you all so much.